اطلب العلم أخي فهو درب به نور، به ترقى به تحيا عالما حرا فخور.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين أما بعد. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Dear beloved students and friends, we continue inshallah with our lessons on Fiqh al-Mu'amalat from al-Durr al-Mukhtar. Before we begin reading and contemplating on the text, I just want to mention a point I think which will be beneficial for everybody, and something which many students have asked me privately and friends also discuss, which is that the fiqh al-mu'amala that we read is not the same as Islamic finance. Right? Fiqh al-mu'amalat is different to Islamic finance. Islamic finance is an extension of fiqh al-mu'amalat. Now, what do I mean by that, and why is there a difference? Fiqh al-mu'amalat is about trading. Right? Fiqh al-mu'amalat is trading. It's the law of trade and commerce, how trades should be performed and executed. Finance, by definition, is all about providing capital on credit. That's what finance is all about. So when we talk about Islamic finance, we're talking about an operation whereby funds are transferred to another party, where that other party will necessarily have credit. They're using those funds to acquire something potentially, or to use it. And there's typically a deferred obligation and liability paid to the counterparty. Whereas in a trade, now let's make this more tangible and real. If I go and buy something from a shop right now, so I walk into the Apple store and I buy a MacBook as an example, I've not financed it, I just buy it directly with cash. That's not finance. That's not called financing whatsoever. In fact, that is called a trade. Okay, so if I walk into a store and buy something, that's called a trade. That's all I'm doing. I'm trading. I've paid with cash on spot without any kind of funding for this particular item. When I take the item, I leave the store. That belongs to me. There's no further obligation between me and the Apple store. There's no further obligations. There's nothing else. It's done. I own the item fully, and there's nothing else for me to pay them. That's a trade. Fiqh al-Mu'amalat talks about trading, how trades should be done. It's not talking about financing operations explicitly. Whereas if we're talking about financing, what would happen in financing is I would go to the Apple store, I would seek financing from somebody. Now, if it's a conventional setup, right, where you are financing in a conventional world, everything is financed with one product, which is interest-based lending. So that can be inventory financing, it can be invoice financing, it can be structured financing, it can be project financing, it can be home financing, car financing, right? All the car financing, there's some differences and it's nuanced. It's not as straightforward as other things. But typically, for the most part, conventional financing is simply interest-based lending. So all they do is they lend you money with interest. So you'll have a financer, they'll give you money, you'll take the funds, you'll go buy whatever you want, and now you owe the financier X amount plus interest over a certain period. Okay, that's what financing is. So there's a credit involved there. There's credit, meaning you are given credit. Somebody lent you funds, in essence. Whereas in mu'amalat and trade, that's not the case. It's just a transaction. It's just a trade. There's no concept of credit. So Islamic finance, because we live in a world of financing today. Your home is financed, your car is financed, your refrigerator, your microwave, your washing machine, and almost every appliance, in fact, even the watch that you potentially wear, and the smartphone that you have. Everything is financed in the world that we live today. We live in a finance-based economy. When that's the case, then the Islamic finance industry has also developed ways to support consumers who are conscious of abiding by Islamic values. They've developed structures to support people to buy and finance these items in an Islamic way. So you can finance things in an un-Islamic way through conventional lending or in an Islamic way. So the key difference then between financing and trading is, number one, financing involves credit. There's typically always credit involved. There is, number two, there'll be, if it's interest-based, there'll be an interest markup there, right? An interest rate. There'll be some kind of margin earned by the financer. And if it's Islamic-based, there'll be profit. Okay, there'll be some profit. Number three, I think which is one of the most important ones, which we have to also keep in mind, is that the risk management is different in both. So in Islamic finance or in financing in general, there's more concern with default risk, credit risk, concentration risk. So whenever you go and finance something, they'll do a credit check. Why will they do a credit check? They're concerned with, will you be able to pay that particular, the financing back? Will you be able to pay them back or not? That's what they're concerned with. Whereas in a trade, there's no concern. The risk analysis and risk management is completely different. The concern is more about operational risk. It's more about asset risk. It's all more about maybe information risk. The risk analysis and the focus of the counterparties is different because there's no credit here. And so financing by definition is different to trading. And that's why mu'amalat is not the same. Okay, mu'amalat is not the same as financing. They're completely Islamic finance. They're completely two different things. Islamic finance is different and mu'amalat is different. However, the question arises then, why is mu'amalat used as a basis for Islamic finance? The answer is very easy. The answer is that just because mu'amalat, fiqh al-mu'amalat in Kitab al-Buyu, it refers to trade contracts, it doesn't mean that these contracts cannot be engineered to develop financing mechanisms. What does that mean? Look, it means we identified almost 4 things in financing. We said, number one is deferred payments. Okay, always in financing, there's deferred payments. Number 2, the pricing mechanism is different. Number 3, typically in Islamic finance anyway, there's not 2 parties, there's typically 3 parties involved. So your typical home financing, there'll be the home owner or the seller, the bank, and you as a customer. 3 parties. It's not a trade, where trade typically has 2 parties. Like my example of going to the Apple store, I walked in, I bought the MacBook, and I walked out. There's 2 parties. But in a financing operation, there's typically 3 parties involved in Islamic finance. Yes, in conventional finance, there's generally just 2 parties. You and the bank. The bank will loan you money, and you pay them back with interest. And then finally, I think the 4th difference would be the usage of collateral, having collateral. Financing most of the time is secured financing. You also have unsecured financing and unsecured lending, where a loan is given without any security, or what we call in Arabic, rahan, right? A collateral in English. There's no security, there's no lien, there's no charge on assets of any sort, whether that's floating or fixed. There's no charge, there's no kind of protection or security in a trade. Right? It's only when there's a deferred payment and obligation does the discussion of security, charges, collateral, and liens be mentioned. So these are the 4 differences. Now, all 4, we know in fiqh, you can add all 4 of these. So you can have in contracts deferred payments. There's no, bil ajal, we'll read about it. there's ijma on this. There's no problem with that whatsoever. You can have a deferred payment from a fiqh and sharia basis. So you can get any trade contract, and all you do is simply add a deferred element to it. You've already constructed somewhat of a financing contract there by inserting a deferred payment element to it. Number two, the pricing. We know that the counterparties can agree to whatever price they want. And we know it's permissible to have a different price for a deferred payment contract versus a spot payment. So a contract which is settled on spot, you can have £100 for that contract. So I'm buying a watch, and I'm paying upfront in cash. That can be priced at £100. And it's also permissible to have a contract whereby you say to me, I'll sell this to you for £150 with 3 months repayment term. So you pay me over 3 months, and the price is £150 for the watch. That's also permissible, right? So that's number two, pricing. The additional party is no problem, because you can have multiple parties in a transaction as long as they're not connected contractually and conditionally upon one another. It's absolutely fine. And the usage of collateral is an entire chapter in fiqh, which is known as rahan, which discusses and explicitly states the permissibility of using rahan in credit transactions. So with that kind of just a brief, you understand that mu'amalat is different to Islamic finance, but Islamic finance is an extension of fiqh al-mu'amalat. That's why there's such a emphasis on Islamic finance, and there's an emphasis on fiqh al-mu'amalat, because fiqh al-mu'amalat is the basis of Islamic finance, right? But there's just some differences which you need to be aware of. So that with that as a brief, just to help the discussion with those students who had asked this question, that's why we have to understand fiqh al-mu'amalat for what it is. And only when we understand fiqh al-mu'amalat can we understand some of the extension in Islamic finance. Of course, Islamic finance is composed of two words. It's composed of Islamic and finance. By understanding and learning fiqh al-mu'amalat, we cannot expect to know Islamic finance. Finance is an entire field. It's an entire sector. It's an entire industry. And also, Islamic finance is more complicated. It's not just simple finance. It's much more involved to it. And therefore, knowing the Islamic side alone is not sufficient. You have to understand and be well versed in finance, economics, governance, and other issues to really have a grip and grasp of Islamic finance. So just learning fiqh al-mu'amalat will not make you an expert in Islamic finance either. Islamic finance is a completely different industry of its own, but it draws its insights and it builds from fiqh al-mu'amalat. Okay, so enough said on that. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. We were on mubadala. We were discussing what mubadala is. Mubadala bi shay'in marghubin fi bimithlihi. Where the author, he mentions that what is bay', and he mentions it's just a mubadala. It's this exchange of value which we discussed. Now, when we talk about mubadala, it's important to understand that parties will do mubadala for mutual benefit. Nobody will enter into a transaction unless they're forced or coerced. But in the normal course of things, a person will enter into a transaction simply because he's benefiting also. So whenever two parties come together to trade, each party desires and wants what the other party has. So if I'm selling a watch to you, I find the money that you have more valuable to me at present. Relatively speaking, it's more valuable to me now than the watch. Because if the watch was more valuable, I would not exchange that. I would keep it. So mubadala is based on mutual benefit. Musharaka, this whole idea of the khasiyat of abwab and of af'al and fi'l. This idea of both parties exchanging but seeing a benefit and trade-off. They're happy to forego what they have. They're not saying I don't deem my asset or item as valuable. They're not saying that. But they're saying relative to what I have, I'm happy to have this trade-off whereby I acquire what you have and you're happy to acquire what I have. Now, why is that the case? Humans have unlimited wants. Okay? And this is one of the greatest economic problems that exist. So any economic book that you read, one of the first things they'll tell you is what economics is all about. And there'll be a discussion on humans having unlimited wants and there being limited means and resources. So there's an issue of scarcity. That's the biggest economic challenge and problem. Things are scarce. When things are scarce, people need to economize. People need to choose and have trade-offs. And people now need to think about opportunity cost. If I take this particular item, what am I losing out on? Which opportunity am I foregoing? And so when humans are always seeking benefit in exchanges and there's a mutual gain to have, resources are limited from a, you could say, economic perspective, but from the Quran and from the Sharia perspective, it's very clear. Resources, it can be argued that resources are not limited because the Quran tells us that وَلَوْ أَنَّ أَهْلَ الْقُرَىٰ آمَنُوا وَاتَّقَوْا لَفَتَحْنَا عَلَيْهِمْ بَرَكَاتٍ مِنَ السَّمَاءِ وَالْأَرْضِ. Allah tells in the Quran that if people believed and had taqwa, then Allah says we would open up the resources of the heavens and the earth for them. Allah would open up the resources. And Allah tells in the Quran over and over again, to Allah belongs miras as-samawati wal ard. Allah, the dominion and kingdom of the heavens and the earth belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah's treasures are unlimited. This is the creation of Allah. Allah is not limited. He can create as much as He wants. So the economic argument of limited resources doesn't really add up per se from a Sharia perspective. But what we have and what we interact with on a day-to-day level may seem limited to us because of the world and construct that we live in. But taqwa, and that's why it's really important to understand this, that from an Islamic perspective and in Islam, our aqeedah and belief is that it's your a'mal have an impact, right? There's a consequence of actions, of good deeds. There's a consequence of sins, of wrongdoing. There's a consequence. And these in and of themselves are factors of production, right? We'll talk about factors of production later on from an economic perspective. But this creates barakah. This also opens up blessings. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala showers you with amwal and manafi' because of good actions and good deeds. So this is a means of gaining more from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's treasure. And so we're not limited by what we see around us. This is what makes Islam and the Islamic economy and the Islamic philosophy of what wealth is all about different. Where our gaze is on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala all the time. And we believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has the ability, and He does provide to whom He wants, how much He wants, when He wants, wherever He wants, as much as He wants, as less as He wants. So there's no scarcity in resources because resources are not in existence on their own. Resources are dependent on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can remove resources from you, or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can increase your resources. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can give you more. That's in the control and command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And therefore that changes the entire economic argument. When you have Iman, the entire economic formula changes. Because now the focus is not on limited resources per se, it's rather about how do you maximize your resources. And that's with taqwa and fulfilling the Sharia principles and abiding by Islam and living the prophetic way. That's the most beneficial way to live and the way to gain from resources. So anyway, going back to our discussion, when both parties are doing mubadala, there's a mutual benefit. Now, the one who's selling, a person will want to sell anything because he's got a benefit. He wants the money that you have. And so he'll be ready to sell almost anything. So in this world that we see today, in the world, you'll see many things which are sold and bought. Some things which you'll think are crazy. How can you buy and sell that? People will sell kidneys, unfortunately. It could be out of desperation or it could be something else. Allah knows best, right? We don't want to judge somebody's intentions. People sell limbs. People sell things which don't exist. People sell financial derivatives. People sell almost like the most weird things. People will sell just to make money. Okay, things which have no real value, no real utility. No sane or reasonable person would want to buy this. But the world today is the world, right? So you get all types of buyers and all types of sellers. That being the case, Islam put in a mechanism to protect people from two things. Number one is protection from deception and this idea of exploitation. Because when everybody is exchanging and trading for their own gain, when the idea is how do I gain by selling this from you? Everybody wants to gain by receiving what's in the other person's hand, in the counterparty's hand. So you'll get all types of sellers. So number one is exploitation and deception. And number two is information asymmetry, which means that buyers typically don't know the full details of what's being sold to them. Right? They typically don't know always, or they may know what's being sold to them, but they can be misinformed. They can be led to believe certain things, or there's many possibilities. Now, when that's the case, the trader and buyer can be deceived. They can be exploited. So the Sharia put two safeguards in place to protect consumers and buyers in the market. That's why number one, the idea we discussed was this mubadalatu shay'in marghub. And what we discussed was mal, something which is, what does shay' marghub mean? Something desirable. From a legal perspective, from the lens of the law, you can't buy something which has no desirable output in it whatsoever. Right? So you can't be party to a contract and trade which has no desirability to it whatsoever, or an asset. You can't buy an asset which has no desirability. If you were to take that to the Islamic court, right, or to any kind of Sharia scholar, they'll say that's not valid, because from a Sharia perspective, a Sharia lens, that item has no utility. It has nothing which is of substance and value. So that's the first mechanism used. And the idea of mal, the shay' marghub, which really refers to mal, it's a self-regulating or peer-regulating or industry-regulating concept. Because when we discussed mal, we mentioned that it all boils down to two things. If you remember from the previous discussions, number one is this idea of desirability and utility. This meylanun nafs, ma yamilu ilayhi tab', right? This desirability that people have. And number two, this concept of iddikhar, which means it's retrievable and storable. And we mentioned that this first concept of meylanun nafs, or ma yamilu ilayhi tab', this concept of desirability and utility, seeking utility, this is a form of regulation. The fuqahas mention and discuss this, that mal is something which some or all people seek. This is a sense of regulation, because mal is in and of itself, it will be defined by urf. We read and we see in the books of fiqh how the fuqaha talk about mal, which is something created for the benefit of people. Now, if it's created for the benefit of people, mal will change according to time and space. In different eras, different spaces, different times, there'll be different items of utility and benefit. So instead of fixing something, Sharia left it open, whereby there's a peer regulation, so to speak, or an industry regulation, or a societal regulation. The customary practice, the society and community will regulate itself, where what people typically buy will be acceptable. What people typically don't buy will not be acceptable. Because if people don't buy something, look, why would people buy something? People buy things, generally speaking, because humans are aqil. They're intelligible beings. They're intelligent. They have volition. They can choose to do things. So if I, as a human, go and buy something, and I have sound capacity, there's nothing wrong with me. I'm not impaired in any way, shape, or form. I go and purchase something. It's because I see benefit in there. Humans are selfish. We have a selfish element to us. We have shuh within us, which Allah tells us in the Quran. Now, this shuh has been embedded within us, this greed and this desire for us to gain. And the hadith also talks about this idea of us wanting, goal upon goal, and nothing will fulfill our kind of desire or our stomachs except for the soil of the grave. And so when human beings they're naturally embedded with a desire and greed to acquire something of benefit, humans will go and seek out what benefits them. And when that's the case, whenever they find something useful, humans will then produce that. They'll manufacture that. They'll sell that to make money. And so sales will emerge from something which has been found to have utility, benefit, and a desirable kind of inclination towards it. And so when that's the case, no human being is going just to sit back and see things of benefit pass in front of their eyes without desiring acquisition. And so this idea of mal then of being self-regulating and being peer-regulated is very powerful, that the industry and the people will decide amongst themselves what is mal and what is not. And from the previous discussion, we mentioned in a definition of mal that it doesn't have to be everybody. Something can be mal to one industry and not to another. Like the fuqaha, I think Ibn Abidin rahimahullah discusses, and others have also mentioned this. They mentioned kafat an-nas wa ba'dihim. They mentioned that it's either everybody sees that as mal, or they have a desirability for it, or some people that ba'd, when we talk about ba'd, it's not just talking about population, as in a few of population, because population can be sliced in many ways. You can even categorize population according to sectors, according to professions, according to where they sit on the supply chain. So when that's the case, you can have items which are mal according to one part of the supply chain, but maybe there's no desirability in the other part of the supply chain. You can have an item which is of use to maybe one sector in industry. For example, pharmaceuticals. There might be something which is beneficial to the pharmaceutical industry, which has no benefit whatsoever to the common man today. But that'll still be mal because some people are benefiting from it. And there's some kind of use case, or at least some kind of utility to the item. So mal can be considered differently according to different sectors and segments of society. That was the first idea of mal, which we mentioned, which Sharia has put in to safeguard people from being deceived and from people being manipulated, and to challenge this kind of information asymmetry. The second idea was more to do with substance of mal, meaning it was more of a technical distinction, that to differentiate mal from manfa'a, the fuqaha mentioned that it has to be something which is muddakhar. It must be something which can be stored for later on, to differentiate that from being similar to services, because the fuqaha mentioned manfa'a cannot be stored. And that's why they say manfa'a, manafi, is not mal. They call it milk. They call that something which is in your ownership, but it's not mal. It's not an item of ownership. It's not an item or property. It's just purely in your ownership. And then when we talk about marghub, shay'in marghub, it all revolves around this idea. What is marghub? Marghub is simply this desirability. That's why the fuqaha discuss things which maybe in the initial days were not desirable, but later fuqaha have discussed things like a leech. They talk about alaq being something which is of mal, because they mention that it helps in sucking out in treatment. It sucks out blood and it helps you in treatment. In those days, a leech could be used, and therefore they found a use case for a leech. Or worms. They found there were certain worms like silkworms and these things. There's a valid halal use case. Sirqin, which is like compost or manure that can be used as a fertilizer. So these things have benefit into it. They found a valid use case. When a use case was found and there was some benefit, it became shay'un marghub. It became desirable. People started selling that and buying that because people wanted it. And so there was an entire production line developed to acquire and sell this item. And that's why the fuqaha mentioned that the principle is that inna jawaz al-bay' yaduru ma'hil al-intifa. Okay? That bay revolves around permissibility of benefiting from something. As long as you can benefit from an item, there's a lawful use case, it'll be permissible to buy in and sell that item. And then Imam Haskafi rahimahullah radiyallahu anhu, he mentions خرج غير المرغوب كتراب وميت ودم. He mentions that from this explanation of, or this definition by Imam Tumurtashi rahimahullah, he mentions that something which has no desirability, like turab, Meita, and dam, they've been excluded. And these are very interesting examples, because on the balance of things and everything we've discussed, soil is bought today. You can go and buy soil from almost any DIY store or any huge store, any gardening store or gardening center. Soil is bought. It's something which people need and want. But maybe in those times, soil had there was no industry for soil. There was no sector to buy and sell soil. There was no demand for it whatsoever. And therefore, there was no supply side either. And therefore, turab, that's one thing. If it's just simple soil or dust, if you think of it as dust and soil, which nobody buys. Yeah, maybe there might be dust and soil of that nature today. But if we're talking about soil that we see more kind of produced and sold at a mass market level, then clearly soil also has a market, and it's sold, it's purchased, it's needed by people for various things. So turab, it could be referring to something very specific in those times, but today, for our context, it's definitely something which is marghub, right? Meita is another thing about turab is, remember we talked, when he's saying kharaja ghayr al-marghub, he's not mentioning whether it is mal or taqawwum, but very clearly we know taqawwum, it will be discussed later on. Taqawwum simply means being halal to trade, something which is lawful and being halal, right? Turab, there's nothing haram about it, as long as there's no najasa or anything on it, of course. Or it's not soaked in najasa, for that matter. But if we look at it from the mal perspective, it definitely has iddikhar, right? It's something which can be stored and retrieved. So definitely the question was more about desirability. And it was more about then, does it have mailan? Do people want this thing? Do people see a market? Do people want to buy? Would people pay for this thing? A reasonable person, would they pay for it? And hence, what I mentioned, that maybe at that time there was no use case, because when there was no use case, there was no market for it, and therefore nobody was willing to pay anything for it, and therefore it can't be something which could be sold in the markets. Right? It would not be able to be sold in the markets. That if this trade was taken to the court, the court would say that this trade is not valid, because you're buying and selling something which the market, the industry, the people themselves don't consider this item to be something which you need to pay for. It has no value. It's worthless. Nobody buys this thing in the market. And therefore, if you have bought this thing from a seller, you've paid for something which has no economic or monetary value in the eyes of people. When there's no economic or monetary value, then you've wasted your money. When you've wasted your money, the counterparty has exploited you, because he's taken money from you unlawfully for something he himself is not giving you any value for. And that's where mubadala is an exchange of value, where if the party sold you soil or turab, let's call it turab. If the party sold you turab and you gave them wealth, it's only been exchange of value from one side and not from both sides. And the mubadala in Sharia necessitates an exchange of value from both sides. And that's why the court will say to you, this is not an exchange of value, rather it's just an exchange of, from one side there's value, and from the other side there's no value. So that's why this sale will not be valid whatsoever. The second example he mentions is Meita. This is an interesting one also, because although explicitly he's not mentioning taqawwum meaning halal, and of course if we're thinking about Meita as in consumption, then we know it's not halal to consume, and so he's not mentioned taqawwum, but then we can definitely rule out iddikhar, because we know an item as Meita, a dead animal, a carcass, let's say, or carrion, which is there, it's something which is tangible. It can be stored and can be retrieved. You can even put it in a freezer and have it, used, taken out later on. So it's physically there, it's tangible, it can be stored. So definitely the issue up here is not to do with retrievability. And again, therefore, you have two possibilities. Either the consideration is of not having taqawwum whatsoever, and that's why he says, he's saying shay'un marghub. He's talking about something which is not desirable whatsoever. It's not desirable from a Sharia perspective, because from a Sharia perspective, since it's not halal to consume this, there is no desirability. There is no valid use case in that sense. When there's no valid use case, then nobody can be made to pay for that, because there's no use in it. There's no benefit in it from a Sharia perspective in terms of consumption. Alternatively, it could be that another angle, a mater as an animal or something which is dead, it's rotting there. Think of an animal which is like the hadith where the Prophet, he was with the companions, and there was a dead donkey or dead animal, and he asked them, like, would anybody buy this? And they said no. And so an analogy was drawn towards the world, right? That this is like the world, or the world is wasaf, or kama qala alayhi salatu wasalam. It has no, and that hadith it captures this very well and encapsulates this idea that a dead animal which is rotting, there's no benefit in it whatsoever. It's mater. There's no desirability for it whatsoever. It's not shay marghub. Nobody would buy that. Nobody would pay for it. So therefore, you can't go and sell that in the market, because it's not an item which is commonly bought in the market, or it's never bought in the market. And therefore, if you were influenced, exploited, manipulated to pay for this item, such a transaction would not be valid. It would not go through. You would have all the right to recover your funds. The third example he gives is dam, which is another interesting example, because if dam is in the context of najasa, right? We're saying dam is not permissible because of najasa, and therefore you can't benefit from this najasa which is there. That's a Shari'i argument, and we could understand that najasa, you can't trade and sell najasa, no problem, and therefore it's to do with taqawwum, because dam again has iddikhar, it can be stored. But then you're saying that there's no desirability in it, because from a Sharia perspective, you can't benefit from it whatsoever. There's another argument for dam as well, though. Another illah, that why would dam be problematic? Trading dam is almost trading a human being, if we're talking about human blood. And the fuqaha talk about, when it comes to trading humans, لِأَنَّهُ جُزْءٌ مِنَ الْأَدَمِ وَالْأَدَمِ بِجَمِيعِ أَجْزَائِهِ مُحْتَرَمْ مُكَرَّمْ. The fuqaha discuss this principle that anything which is a part of a human being that cannot be traded or sold, you can't buy and sell that thing. It's not to do with the problem of the item itself. Nothing wrong with a human per se, but it's more to do with you could say a peripheral or an additional reasoning. That is, a human being with all of its parts, right, is muhtaram mukarram. Sharia has given it ihtiram. Sharia has given human being sanctity. A human is sacred. And whatever is sacred, when you sell that thing, it's a form of ibtidal. It's a form of disgrace. It's a form of, ridiculing the value and worth of that thing. It doesn't suit that thing to be traded and sold. So the fuqaha, when they talk about this, they're saying that a human being or dam or any element of a human being, you can never have a human being or part of a human being one part of a negotiation or contract or transaction. Because no matter what you equate with a human being, the human being will always be more valuable. You can't buy, that trade-off can never be made. There can be nothing used to acquire and buy a human being. That will be ibtidal, which means that will be disgraceful for something or a being which Allah has created and Allah has made muhtaram, mukarram, Allah has honored and sanctified and given sacredness to. So humans with all their makeup inside and all their parts, it's all sacred, has sanctity, and it can't be traded. That's another way to consider dam, if you're not going to talk about the najasa way, and not going to explore that particular angle. So there's two angles there that can be explored in terms of dam. But this will be discussed much more in Bay'ul Fasid. There's a whole discussion on this further, which talks about this najasa and other matters. And of course, it has no other time, no beneficial utility. But if we talk about the idea of muhtaram, mukarram, and human beings, then it can never be sold. No matter, even though it's needed today, blood has a lot of value for transfusions and donations and all these things. But from a Sharia perspective, because of this peripheral or this overpowering, overarching reasoning and rationale, it can never be traded, no matter what. It's part of a human being which is sanctified. Yeah, you can potentially donate it and transfuse it and give it to people, tabarru'an, and benefit people with it, but there should be no price for it. You can't benefit from that thing. Because if you commoditize, yeah, this is the word. If you commoditize, and commercialize human beings, you're degrading them. It's a form of degradation, a form of ridiculing, and basically disgracing a human being. So to commoditize, commercialize, and monetize on humans and their body parts is prohibited, and that goes against the very essence of the sanctity of human beings. And so that's what he mentions. And then the Imam Haskafi, Imam Tashi mentions, ala wajhin mufidin makhsusin. He just mentions that this bay and transaction should be done in a particular manner. Ala wajhin makhsus. What does this mean? There's a due process. Okay, there's a due process that you can't, a transaction is a form, a contract is a form. It's just not a random, spontaneous thing. And that's why in English law, you call that a meeting of the minds. There's an entire process, there's an understanding what both parties want to do. There's offer and acceptance. Even in English law, there's offer and acceptance, there's consideration, there's meeting of the minds, there's all these things which are there. Like fiqh and Islamic law, very similar, many overlaps. So a contract is formulated based on a process. It's not randomly executed. And why is this process relevant? It's because this process has to be performed in order for the laws of Sharia to be executed and for the laws of Sharia to be manifest. So if this contract was to be taken to a qadi and a judge, he can look at the apparent and say to you, a transaction has taken place. Because as you know, a qadi, his job is to rule by the apparent. And if he sees a transaction taking place, he'll say, based on the apparent a transaction has taken place, all the processes have been fulfilled. The framework for a transaction has taken place. Whereas, as you know, a mufti is different to a qadi. A qadi's role is to maintain social order, and therefore he rules on the apparent to maintain the society, right? Whereas a mufti is more of like a private counsel. He's more of a personal advisor. So he's more of a personal order. He wants your personal affairs to be intact. That's why a mufti can look at and give fatwa based on diyana. He can ask you, okay, but what did you intend? What did you mean? Whereas a qadi can never do that. A qadi will just rule on the apparent, and he sees whatever he sees, he'll rule accordingly, and what he documents that he has. Whereas a mufti can also ask for more personal things and give a fatwa accordingly. So a qadi maintains social order, whereas a mufti is more like a personal advisor, more of like a legal counsel in today's terminology. And that's why this wajh makhsus is important, because for legal implications, it needs wajh makhsus, and even for processes. A contract is a very complex set of processes where the net result is transfer of ownership. There has to be a process. There has to be wajh makhsus. There has to be a way of executing this. And that's what the fuqaha are going to talk about in the coming next sentences, inshallah. So we'll end here. Subhanallah bihamdihi.
اطلب العلم أخي فهو درب به نور، به ترقى به تحيا عالما حرا فخورا.